Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Colton, and for today's video, I've got a bit of a sweet treat for you. So today we're going to be comparing the Pentax 645D to the Fujifilm GFX 50S. So I have some candy that I need to shoot, and I thought this would be a perfect opportunity to kind of put these cameras head to head. And for this test, we'll be using the kit native sort of zoom lens for each of these systems. I guess kit might not be the perfect word to use, but on the Pentax side, we're going to use the 45 to 85 f4, and on the Fujifilm side, we'll be using the 32 to 64 f4 lens. So kind of the standard zoom range for both systems. And then the lighting will all be identical. The position will be identical. We'll zoom into the same exact perspective on both, and our subject won't change either. So all the other variables are pretty much the same. And we'll just see what we get out of these two cameras. We'll be mainly looking at color and saturation in the default RAW file, but we may also look at resolution and sharpness a bit as well. Although there could definitely be a test in the future, maybe a little bit more detailed comparison where we're using one lens on both systems to remove that variable of the lens. So we'll see. But for now, this is the test that we're doing. Without further ado, let's bust out the cameras, set up our candy, and get shooting. All right, so here are our default files straight out of camera. On the left side, we've got the Pentax 645D RAW file, and on the right-hand side, we have the Fujifilm GFX 50S default RAW file. And, obviously we have a pretty stark difference between the two. I think on the Pentax side, there is a little bit of an issue with the white balance. It is skewing a bit warmer. You can tell by just looking at the chocolate, or at least the white chocolate bars. They're kind of coming out almost a bit yellow or a bit creamy. And even though they are cookies and cream, they should be more of a white color, a pure white. So this is an issue that I've seen with this particular Pentax camera, but also with other cameras that have Kodak CCD sensors. So I don't know if that's a characteristic of the sensor, if Kodak maybe had a hand in helping determine the color science for cameras that use their sensors, and they kind of skewed it a little more towards the warm side. But that does seem to be something I see pretty frequently on those CCD cameras. The other big standout here is that it's quite a bit more saturated than the Fujifilm file. And that is something I've noticed specifically with this Pentax camera is pretty common, and something I like, honestly. I like to have a nice saturated image. And so when the RAW file is already starting out fairly saturated, it's just already putting me towards the ballpark of where I already want to go with the final product. So that's a benefit in my opinion, but definitely that would be the big call out there. On the Fujifilm side, a bit more muted, but I think also more accurate in the white balance. I think the color accuracy is about the same between the two. It's just that the Fujifilm more accurately nailed the white balance, and so overall it looks a bit more accurate. but also a bit more muted than the Pentax file. And the Fujifilm is probably closer to reality in terms of saturation, but it is a little bit on the more muted side than reality, whereas the Pentax is quite a bit more saturated than it actually looked in real life. So these are kind of the default files. I will zoom in here a bit. They're not going to link up perfectly because we do have different resolutions at play. And it's worth noting we also have different lens at play. So these are both the standard zoom lens for each system, but that does mean they are different lens. And as such, one lens could be a bit sharper than the other. So I won't attribute the sharpness factor to specifically Fuji sensor or anything like that. We'll have to do a longer test in the future where we maybe use the exact same vintage lens on both systems so we can see how that differs. But just zooming in, we do have pretty similar colors. Again, Pentax a bit more saturated, a bit warmer, but if we were to correct for that, I think they would look about the same. So I'm not seeing anything on either one that stands out as being massively different from the other. So we'll switch over now to the files that I edited. And look, what I will say here is I could go back and edit these again a few more times and get them even closer. But this was the sort of initial edit, and I think I got them pretty close. I think the biggest difference between these two that could still be corrected is the red background could be tweaked just a little bit on both of these files to get it even closer. But that kind of stands out to me. Now, the other big factor is, I always say this about the Pentax files, but when you have gummies, they tend to have sort of a glowing effect. And when you look at the Fujifilm side, they don't seem to be glowing as much. They seem to be a bit darker. So that is kind of a characteristic I've noticed with the Pentax. If we zoom in a bit here, you can see how the Fujifilm file is a bit darker, doesn't glow as much, and it's almost as if the light is penetrating this candy more on the Pentax side. Not sure why that is. As I edited these files, I never could quite get the Fujifilm files to glow like the Pentax files did. So that's definitely a characteristic difference. But what I will say on the benefit of the Fuji side is that it does seem like the image was much easier to correct and make a more even exposure across the board. So when I do a lighting setup, my studio is not the best and the light is pretty harsh. It's very uneven and I have to go in post-production and even it out. But when I look at the Fujifilm file, especially with these Kit Kats, they all seem to be the exact same exposure, the exact same brown. There's not a lot of differences here. They all look great. And on the Pentax side, I am seeing some differences. Some of that is because of the masking that I did, but some of it is just the file itself. So as an example, we're catching a lot more highlights on this Kit Kat than we are on this Kit Kat in the far left-hand side. And similarly, the Kit Kat here in the bottom right is way darker. It's almost like a dark chocolate Kit Kat as opposed to the lighter the lighter brown that these other Kit Kats have. So a little bit more inconsistency. Again, some of that, maybe I was a little more heavy-handed with the corrections and masking on the Pentax side, but I do find that the Pentax files tend to take quite a bit more masking and editing to get them more evened out in terms of the lighting and exposure than more modern CMOS sensors do. Now that could be an issue with my Pentax. Maybe the shutter's dying. Fingers crossed that it's not. But that could be the reason why there. So, between these two files, they started very different, but they've kind of ended up pretty close. And if I were to go in here and edit a bit more, I think I could get them even closer. So, at the beginning of the day, they start different, but they end almost the same. All right, so those are the results of our comparison. Let me know what you thought, if anything stood out to you, pros or cons. Again, I'll definitely make maybe a more detailed comparison of these two cameras in the future. I did want to add in as far as beyond the photograph, beyond the image quality, but the actual physical systems themselves. You know, really, it's a bit of a mixed bag. There's pros and cons either way. On the Pentax side, we have a very slow processor. So when you take a picture with a RAW file, you're looking at 12 seconds to save that RAW file. And if you fill the buffer, it's going to take almost a full minute to clear that out before you can review any of the images. And that is really a bit tedious, a bit annoying. But it is not a game breaker, so it's definitely easy to kind of work around that. You know, pros for the Pentax, the button layout is kind of a mixed bag in both, but it makes slightly more sense in my opinion, especially when we get into the menu system for the Pentax. And then just the Pentax in general is a cheaper system. The camera body to camera body, you can find some Fujifilms that are cheaper, you can find some Pentax that are cheaper, but when you get into the native lens part, the Pentax just has extremely cheap lens compared to the Fujifilm. You're looking at $1,000, $2,000 for a Fujifilm lens, and you're looking at $200 to $400 for a mint condition Pentax lens. So no brainer, Pentax is the cheaper brand to go with. You know, on the Fujifilm side, the glass is excellent. The bodies are a little bit more of a sort of standard camera layout. Processing times are significantly better. You can take a picture and immediately look at that file after you've taken it. And I would also say the fact that it's a mirrorless camera does open a very distinct advantage in being able to adapt vintage lens or just lens from other systems, and to be able to maybe even set up some tilt shift configurations that aren't really possible on the Pentax side. So really pros and cons both ways, but I also don't think you can go wrong either way. So let me know your thoughts on these systems, especially if you've shot either camera. I think it's still too early for me to say which is my favorite, but I'd probably lean towards the Pentax files at the end of the day. But with that being said, if you enjoyed the video, do give me a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see that more detailed comparison in the future, hit the subscribe button, ring the bell, and that's going to keep you in the know for when the next video drops. But for now, I'm Colton. I'll see you in the next one.